Howdy ESSM 406. This lecture, we're going to talk about not 5, but 6 P's that we can classify environmental policy instruments under. So this is actually based on the readings by Salzman, and this lecture is supplemental to that reading. It may really help you to read that Salzman reading before listening to the lecture. So Salzman tries to characterize different types of environmental policies. He says there are 5. But we think there are 6. So we're going to share them all with you today. So the first one we look at is called prescriptive regulation, which is really command and control, which we talked about last lecture. This is where the government tells you what to do. And a lot of our most important environmental laws, like the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, they rely on that. They're fairly simple to administer, and they have really predictable results. And as we talked about, they have some weaknesses, which include being having no incentives, having a lot of political loopholes, and being fairly inflexible. Our second instrument is looking at property rights. So this is where the government basically distributes property rights. And Salzman uses the example from Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, which you read, which is about dividing up the rights of a pasture for people who are grazing their animals on it so it's not overgrazed. So historically, governments have done that, but today when we talk about environmental policy, we tend to talk about property rights in terms of cap and trade programs or tradable fishing rights. The strengths of this instrument is it really allows markets to work. It's less expensive to run, and it's more flexible, so companies can decide which strategy they want to use. The problems are, it can be very expensive and setup, particularly when we're thinking of cap and trade, tradable fishing rights, that setup can be really difficult to do. We're going to talk a little bit more about how it can also lead to hotspots in a later lecture. The third instrument we're going to talk about is penalties. This is when the government taxes bad behavior. So carbon taxes is one you've probably heard a lot about. We don't have it, but it's one that's been discussed a lot for climate change. We also have gas taxes and highway tolls. And you can think of them as tools to discourage driving, although they're usually described as ways to pay for highway construction and maintenance. But they're also used for trying to discourage people from driving. Another one that we talk about is raising water rates, and I think some of you are using this example or this issue in your policy memos. And this is when you raise the fees of people who are consuming waters at various levels to try and create lower use of water. So like property rights, these are really economically efficient. They allow the market to work. But the problem is that many people in the US particularly, but all over the world, hate taxes. So actually, penalties can often be thought of as the same as a cap and trade program. Now, I won't go into the economics of that, but you can work out the costs and benefits and impacts, which could be similar in certain ways to environmental taxes and certain kinds of cap and trade programs. But the biggest weakness is that nobody likes the word tax. Well, so maybe we just need to be more creative in our messaging because these could be really useful tools, and they seem to work really well in water markets. Since we're already used to paying for water, raising the water rate or increasing your consumption to pay for certain parts of infrastructure already makes sense to us. So that's one of the issues when we look at if we add new taxes, people just aren't used to paying for it. Now, on the opposite side of penalties are actually payments or subsidies. This is when the government is going to pay you to do something good or having good behavior. So examples of this are some of the NRC conservation programs. They have lots of subsidies for people that exhibit good behavior. And people like to be paid for doing things. We don't like taxes, but we do love subsidies, which of course is inconsistent. Someone has to pay for the tax to provide the subsidy. One of the other problems is that a lot of subsidies are provided for projects or programs that aren't really good ideas. An example of this is grazing on national forests. This is super controversial, and the fees people have to pay to graze their animals on these lands turns out to be subsidized. If people had to graze their livestock elsewhere, they'd have to pay much higher fees. And so many people would argue that we shouldn't be giving subsidies. And I'm sure you can think of other examples where we're subsidizing bad environmental behavior. So sometimes eliminating subsidies could be a way to improve environmental behavior. Our next example is persuasion, and this is when the government tries to persuade you about changing your behavior. So one of the really good examples of this is when the government gives you information, like the Energy Star program, although that one may be on the chopping block. When you go buy a large appliance, ones that are energy efficient and can save you money, have an Energy Star on them. And the APA was running this program. And it's a way for consumers to learn about the products they're buying and how it can save them money. So there's just really information that's given by the government to persuade you. Another example is Smokey the Bear. Smokey the Bear is trying to encourage people to have good behavior when they're in the forest, when they're in national parks, not starting fires. Now, the benefits to this are there's really no coercion. It's simply an information campaign by the government. The weaknesses are some of those campaigns, the effects can be really small. Now, you'll see that the last 5 that I've given you, the first one is really all about being command and control from the government. And the other ones are more market-based. I want to also add the idea of provision. Now, in your assignment, you are supposed to be comparing the market-based versus the government, so command and control versus the ones that are in blue. But there's some that don't necessarily fit into those categories, so I want to share it with you, and we're going to call it provision. And this is when the government just goes and does it. So examples of this include national parks, wildlife refuges. You can also think of reservoirs. A lot of times governments will build reservoirs that supply water. Sometimes it's done by private companies, but it's often the government that builds the reservoir. These are a lot easier to set up. They're easier to administer. There's no coercion. But the negatives are that it can be really expensive, and sometimes it's not the best solution for all projects. So this gives you an overview of the major policy instruments that Salzman is talking about in this 3.1 unit. In the next unit, we're really going to go into some additional instruments that don't fit here but are still widely used. But for this memo, I want you to focus on trying to understand your policy issue on whether the solution of market-based or a solution on command and control is going to be better for your issue. I hope that helps, and happy writing.